Okay, first grade readers, we are about to go on a reading adventure today with the story of Fancy Nancy. And just like we learned yesterday, when you go on a reading adventure, you have to start with a sneak peek. So let's take a sneak peek here at the cover of this book. I'm noticing that the title is Fancy Nancy. I'm seeing a little girl here on the cover, and it does look like she's pretty playful, right? She's all dressed up in costume. I'm wondering if that's Nancy. And I'm using the clues that we talked about today about how most authors put the main character on the cover of the book. So I bet you that this is Fancy Nancy, and we're going to read more about her. Let's kind of flip through some of the pages and continue our sneak peek before we do our big important reading work today of understanding the character. So let's see. It looks like maybe Nancy is going on some adventures with her family, perhaps, right? Looks like a mom and a dad and maybe a sibling. It looks like they're doing more even, maybe at a grocery store. So maybe Fancy Nancy likes to go on some adventures. I wonder if she gets herself into any trouble with her family when she's on these adventures. It looks like her family also likes to sort of dress up and pretend and be fancy with her. So maybe that's where she gets this playfulness from. Okay, we did a sneak peek of our adventure, and now it's time to do our big important reading work of today, which is getting to know and understand our characters. So in this lesson, we're talking about how characters are the most important thing in the story. And while we read about Nancy today, I want you to ask yourself, what are you learning about her? What does she like? What does she not like? Because she is the most important person in this story for us to get to know today. So this book is called Fancy Nancy, and it's written by Jane O'Connor. And I'm going to model for you in the beginning of the story how I might start to understand Nancy as a character based on some of what she says and some of what she does, what she tells us that she likes and what she doesn't like. And by the end of the story today, you're going to have to be able to come up with one more thing that you can tell your teachers about Nancy, okay? Fancy Nancy, written by Jane O'Connor. I love being fancy. Right away, Nancy has told us that she loves something, right? She loves being fancy. My favorite color is fuchsia. That's a fancy way of saying purple. I like to write my name with a pen that has a plume. That's a fancy way of saying feather. And I can't wait to learn French because everything in French sounds fancy. Nobody in my family is fancy at all. They never even ask for sprinkles. So far we learned that Nancy is fancy and she loves being fancy. We also learned, I think, that Nancy is pretty smart, right? She has lots of fancy vocabulary words. She said fuchsia for purple, and she said plume for a feather. So I like that Nancy right away has told us that she's smart and that she's fancy. We're just waiting for the page to turn. There's a lot they don't understand. Lace-trimmed socks do help me to play soccer better. Sandwiches definitely taste better when you stick in frilly toothpicks. A princess is supposed to keep her tiara on. What's a fancy girl to do? I ask my doll Maribel. Her full name is Maribel Lavinia Chandelier. We also learned on this page that Nancy likes to play soccer, right? Then I get an idea that is stupendous. That's a fancy word for great. Maybe I can teach my family how to be fancy. I make an ad and stick it on the fridge. Soon there is a knock on my door. My family saw the ad. They want to get started right away. Start to pay attention if you're noticing anything about Nancy. Are you learning about her? The trouble is my family doesn't own any fancy clothes. That's okay. I go find. What is that fancy word? Oh, yes. Some accessories. Ooh la la, my family is posh. That's a fancy word for fancy. My mom twirls in front of the mirror. Why don't we go somewhere fancy tonight? How about dinner at the King's Crown? Dad suggests. Wow, my parents are acting fancier already. May I escort you lovely ladies outside? The limousine is waiting. My dad is our chauffeur. That's a fancy word for driver. When we arrive at the King's Crown, everyone looks up. They probably think we're movie stars. I am so proud of my whole family. They eat with their pinkies up and call each other darling. For dessert, let's have parfaits, my mom says. That's French for ice cream sundaes. Amazing! My mother knows French. When our parfaits are ready, I curtsy and say, Merci. I carry the tray like a fancy waiter. Oops, I trip, I slip. The tray does a double flip. I don't feel fancy anymore. I want to go home. After I get all cleaned up, I put on my dressing gown. Those are fancy words for a bathrobe. I feel much better. I'm ready for a parfait. I tell my parents, thank you for being fancy tonight. I love you, my dad says. I love you, my mom says. And all I say back is I love you, because there isn't a fancy or better way of saying that. Okay, first graders, now that you spent some time doing big, important reading work today, understanding that characters are the most important thing in the story, I want you to ask yourself, what did you learn about Nancy in the story today? So think about some of her actions, some of what she said to you, right? Things that she said from her mouth, things that she did in the story. And I want you to type on this slide one character trait that you learned about Nancy today. So really understanding a character based on what they do in a story and what they say in a story is a really important reading skill when you go on these reading adventures. So think about some of the stuff that you learned about Nancy. We talked in the beginning of the book how we know that she loves to be fancy. I talked about how she had sort of a big vocabulary. So I said that based on her using some of those fancier words, I thought that that made Nancy pretty smart. And so think about some of the other stuff that she did with her family, at the restaurant, when she got home with her family, and see if you can come up with some words or just one word to describe Nancy. Is she loving? Is she playful? Is she creative? Does she have a big imagination? Is she playful and fun? So think about something that you can say to describe Nancy and tell your teachers why you think Nancy is that way based on an example from the book.